Welcome to Amazing Grays. This show is dedicated to the idea that active, informed older adults are an essential part of today's society. We provide information regarding senior issues and concerns and salute individuals or groups who demonstrate that productivity doesn't end at retirement.
Hi there, welcome to this segment of Amazing Grays. My name is Ed Whitbread, and this is a special program for us. We're going to take the full half hour this time around and talk about a new book. The book is called The Unholy Murder of Ash Wednesday. This is not a religious book. And with us today are Jeff Pinski, former manager of the Morning News, long career in journalism and then at Edinburgh, and former detective DiPaolo, current district judge. The tagline on this says, "The stained life and rude times of Mob Wannabe Bolo Dovashaw." If that doesn't sell books, I don't know what will. Who was Bolo Dovashaw and what happened to him?
Well, Bolo Dovashaw was born and raised in Erie. He originally was an East Sider and then moved into Little Italy after his dad passed away, and got involved with all the typical youth in the Little Italy area. Went from job to job, but he basically couldn't hold a job. Not that it was too tough for him, he was a little lazy, didn't want to work. Decided to get into the numbers racket. First start working at Dee's cigar store. Liked that environment, liked the idea of doing what he was doing. And then at some point in his life, in an early age, he had his own book. And what I mean by a book is that he basically wrote numbers, laid off to different organizations in Buffalo and Pittsburgh, and then had himself probably one of the most lucrative bookmaking operations in northwestern Pennsylvania.
What was the time frame?
This probably started, I would want to say, in the 70s, middle 70s into the 80s.
And he met his untimely end in the early 80s.
1983, January the 3rd.
What were some of the numbers that he might have written? I mean, the dollars involved.
Oh, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. They would probably have a good week writing $100,000 a week, easy.
So this was not petty Addy?
No, this was, he had probably over 100 writers that were working for him that entailed probably all of Erie County. Okay,
bring us back to what actually happened that day.
Okay, basically what had happened was there was a contract hit on him, and the idea was that before they killed him, they had to get his keys to his safety deposit box. Bolo basically worked out of his boxes in the bank. That's where his stash was kept. He had been broken into at his home probably 2 or 3 times. He was a victim of an armed robbery back in 1980 where they tuned him up pretty well. And they found his hiding place, which was in a vanity bathroom in his home. So naturally, after that robbery, he decided that he was going to keep his stash outside of the house and basically kept it in a bank where he did business at. Naturally, the people that are involved in this all knew that he didn't keep it in his home anymore, and that's the reason why they had to get the keys to the safety deposit boxes before they killed him. And then as the story goes, the hitman, after retrieving the keys, then shot him 1 time in back of the head and then left him in his home. The idea was to take him out of the home and bring him to Cleveland. That's where the hitman was from. But because of the size of Bolo, he couldn't lift him by himself.
When I read the book, I found it kind of mind-boggling. Nobody realized he was 240 pounds.
Yeah.
And one person was going to drag him upstairs out to the car.
It wasn't too well planned.
Let's stop there. And when I read this, in some ways, it's almost like one of those Russian novels where there's just characters all over the place and names and some of the nicknames, and you try and tie them together. The one I think of as a character is not an individual, but a phrase you used a little bit ago, Little Italy. Most of the players in your book either grew up in that environment or were very much affected by it.
That's correct.
Tell us about living. You were from Little Italy.
I was born and raised 900 block West 18th Street.
Tell us about the neighborhood.
Well, it was a great neighborhood. It's middle class. There's no doubt the fathers and mothers worked. Not so much the mothers in those days, but the fathers all worked. The people that are involved in this all came out of the same neighborhood that I did. There's a lot of guys that became doctors. There's ones that became lawyers, professional people, policemen, firemen. And then unfortunately, there's people that just didn't want to work and wanted to live off the land by doing what they did. But it was a great community to live in. There's a lot of great people in there. And basically, like I said, there was a lot of well-known people that came out of Little Italy. So it isn't that it's all Italian people that we're talking about in this book. It just so happened that these are the people that lived in this area and were involved in this.
Hey, Ed, let me add here.
I was just going to say,
well,
Jeff, what's a nice Jewish boy like you doing in the middle of all this? Tell us about how
I ended up in Little Italy. Like, I wanted to add to what Dominick was saying, is that Little Italy was almost a self-contained city. You didn't have to leave there. They had their own bakeries, their own pharmacies, their own grocery stores, their churches, schools there. So it was a very tight-knit community, even though it expanded, maybe several square miles within the city of Erie. You really wouldn't even have to leave there. You can spend your entire life. You worked in shops there, for instance. A lot of people at that time, when we talk about going back post-World War II, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, some people didn't have cars. They didn't need cars. They walked every place. They could get to wherever they were going from their own homes. So it's a tight-knit community. And one of the important things as you bring up is that people came out of that same background with that first and second generation Americans that you see, whether it's on the east side or throughout the country. And they were hardworking people. They raised families. They paid taxes. Yet out of those same environments, which were moral homes, church-going people, some people turned to productive, honest lives, all the professions, and very honorable. And yet, on the other side, there were people that went in a totally different direction. And unfortunately, this book centers on many of those folks and what they did.
And the interesting thing is that in that environment where it's, like you say, kind of a self-contained area, everybody knows everybody. Everybody interrelates, regardless of which way they went growing up. That you can't help.
Yeah, everybody knew everybody in the neighborhood. They knew what they were doing in the neighborhood. The homes were very close together. But it was a type of thing where everybody sat out on their porches and the kids all played together. And I mean, it was one big happy family in those days.
Jeff, let's come back to, again, I'm kind of a process nut. How did your involvement come here? My assumption when I read this book, okay, Jeff wrote it, he talked. And that's not really true, is it?
No.
So tell me about it.
Well, first of all, I think Dominick and I go back to my first recollection is probably 40 years ago with the Donald Lee Chisholm murder case. And this is a horrible mass murder, Erie's first mass murder. And what made it so heinous and so horrific was there were 3 young children involved. 5 people were killed in all, but three of them were young children. And the trial, because of all the publicity, got moved out of Erie County and into Lycoming County. It was held at the courthouse in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. And Dominick and his partner, Dave Bagnoni, were the chief investigators on this. And I ended up covering that for the newspaper, and I stayed for 2 weeks there in Williamsport. So I got to know Dominick a lot better. And out of that, you develop in many cases, press and the police have this symbiotic relationship where, they help each other out. Well, ours went a little bit further, and we became friends over the years, and we went to each other's, family events, and became close, and decided that when Dom retired from the police department, that there was a book here waiting to be told, a story waiting to be told, because it's a compelling story, and many of the events were not in the newspaper or on the evening news and could not be told. Now they could be told. So we began working on it then. But we had our day jobs as well, and so it was a slow process. We had a few false starts where we did a lot of rewriting. Dominick wrote everything out in hand and gave it to me, and then we put it into a novel-like. We eventually decided we were going to do it in third-person form. We're going to write it in novel-like form where we can tell what happened first. So the reader got a view of what was going on and what the main thrust of the story and the main theme, what that was about. And then they got to see throughout the book how Dom put it together piece by piece. It was a slow, painstaking process. And along the way, there were threats upon his life. There were other murders, there were arsons, and overall there were over 400 names that we put in this book.
This is really a whodunit. I mean, you know up front a lot in the opening pages, but there's a lot you don't find out until late in the book, and we're not going to talk about that now. You talked about a slow process. How long was it from the time you got involved when you thought, okay, this is where I drop this thing?
Well, it wasn't that I wanted to drop it or did drop it. I had an idea from the get-go who could have been possibly involved, but for me to prove it was another thing. So basically I did what I did over the 7 full years. 7 full years before we brought everybody to trial.
And they say that the average homicide, if it isn't solved in the first 2 days, probably
48 hours is very tough, But it was a lot of roadblocks during that time period, but we got through the roadblocks and did what we had to do.
What were the differences in the police department in those days compared to now? Your world, you're a district judge now. You're still in tune with what happens in City Hall.
Well, the police department, it was a good police department, just as it is today. Basically, we were in a situation where it was very, very political. And there were certain things that you could do and certain things you couldn't do because there was orders that were flying around by the powers that be. It was a tough case because of the fact that there were some people in the police department at that particular time that I knew were involved with some of these bookies and guys that were doing different burglaries. So it was kind of tough to try to maintain doing your reports at the station without somebody looking over your shoulder, basically seeing what you were doing. Absolutely. So it was to the point where I was able to work with the Attorney General's office, and then I moved out of basically City Hall and the police department, and that's where this whole investigation came from, or started, I should say, at the Attorney General's office. And then basically I worked out of their offices up at the Griswold Plaza.
Okay, and this might be a good time to take just a short break and come back and then talk about the nuts and bolts of what happened in those 7 years.
Sure, thank you very much.
We'll come back on.